Welcome to the Humanized Books channel, when we will bring you mini books based on summaries of other books, preserving their essence but expressed through other perspectives. Today's mini book is S From Trauma to Freedom, inspired by I'm Glad My Mom Died, Jennette McCurdy. This mini book is created for education, inspiration, and deeper understanding, offering a compassionate look into how childhood trauma can shape a life and how courage and healing can rebuild it. Let's focus on what comes next. Plug in your headphones and let's get started. Introduction. Jennette McCurdy begins her story in a place most people never expect healing to start, confronting the reality of her mother's death. In the prologue, she describes an uneasy mix of relief, guilt, and confusion, emotions that clash sharply with society's expectations of grief. Holding the urn that contains her mother's ashes, she realizes she doesn't feel what she thinks she should. This moment becomes the emotional doorway to everything that follows. Her entire life had been built around pleasing her mother, protecting her mother, and becoming whatever her mother needed her to be. Now, standing in the silence her mother left behind, Jennette must face a difficult truth. She has no idea who she is without that influence. This mini-book explores that journey, the unraveling, the reckoning, and the rebuilding, showing how a child shaped by control and emotional dependence grows into an adult who fights to reclaim her identity, voice, and autonomy. The book is divided into two sections, before and after, which describe the events of her life before and after the death of her mother. Section 1, Before, will include 7 clusters. The first cluster is Early Childhood and Family System. Jennette McCurdy's early childhood unfolded within a household shaped by instability, illness, and a mother whose needs overshadowed every other reality. From her earliest memories, Jennette learned that her value in the family depended on compliance, on being agreeable, quiet, and emotionally accessible to her mother at all times. The environment was not violent in the obvious physical way, but deeply destabilizing. Emotional landmines existed everywhere. Jennette's role was clear. She was the child who would not cause trouble, the daughter who would adapt herself into whatever shape her mother needed. Her mother's presence was simultaneously suffocating and unpredictable. She could be affectionate in bursts, enthusiastic and energetic, especially when Jennette aligned perfectly with her ambitions. But that affection carried a price: total obedience. Jennette internalized this quickly. The household revolved around her mother's moods, fears, and obsessions. Jennette learned early that love came with conditions and that harmony required self-erasure. Deborah McCurdy's battle with cancer loomed over Jennette's childhood like a constant threat. Her illness created an atmosphere where everyone treated her with heightened sensitivity. Nothing could be questioned, nothing could be refused. The family's emotional ecosystem wrapped itself around her fragility. As a child, Jennette didn't have the language to understand this dynamic, but she understood its rules. Her mother was the center of gravity, and everyone else orbited her. Jennette's father was physically present but emotionally muted, passive, distant, and always overshadowed by Deborah's intensity. The unspoken structure of the household was matriarchal, not in empowerment, but in domination. Deborah controlled the narrative, the expectations, and the emotional temperature. Jennette's brothers floated at the edges, developing their own coping mechanisms. But Jennette, sensitive, eager to please, deeply bonded, became the child her mother latched onto most tightly. Deborah's worldview was rigid and full of fear. She feared contamination, mess, imperfection, and anything that threatened her delicate sense of control. Jennette absorbed these fears as facts, not realizing until adulthood how distorted they were. Normal childhood experiences, privacy, independence, exploration, were treated as dangers. Jennette grew up navigating a minefield of expectations, always aware that stepping outside her mother's emotional comfort zone could trigger disapproval or collapse. This environment planted the roots of Jennette's lifelong struggle. Her sense of self was never nurtured, only shaped according to her mother's emotional needs. When a parent's identity is fragile, the child becomes the stabilizer. Jennette learned early that her worth depended on making her mother's world function. She carried burdens far beyond her age: emotional caretaker, source of joy, symbol of hope, and eventually vessel for unfulfilled ambitions. The household taught her that feeling uncomfortable was normal, that suppressing her own needs was expected, that love meant obedience, and that her mother's approval was the ultimate reward, the approval she would chase for years, even when it harmed her. Childhood, for Jennette, was not defined by innocence, exploration, or individual growth. It was defined by containment, expectation, and the quiet training that her body, mind, and identity were not entirely her own. Cluster 2: Mother's Control, Perfectionism, and Illness. Deborah McCurdy's illness shaped every corner of the household, not only through fear of her dying, but through the way it amplified her need for control. Cancer created a narrative in which she was the fragile hero of the family, and everyone else, especially Jennette, existed to support her emotionally. The disease gave Deborah a kind of moral authority. Anyone who challenged her risked being viewed as heartless or ungrateful. For Jennette, this meant childhood was lived under a powerful psychological shadow. Pleasing her mother was not just good behavior, it was a matter of moral righteousness. Deborah wielded perfectionism like a survival skill, and she passed it down to Jennette before the girl was old enough to question it. Cleanliness, obedience, image, politeness, everything had to be controlled. Messes weren't just messes, they were threats. Disorganization wasn't a mild flaw, it was a sign that something was wrong. Jennette absorbed this without resistance, not because she naturally leaned toward perfection, but because her mother's approval depended on it. Every praise from Deborah felt like sunlight. Every disappointment felt like the world collapsing. That emotional intensity shaped how Jennette came to see herself. Privacy was treated as suspicious. Personal boundaries were unnecessary. Deborah believed that a good daughter should be an extension of her mother, emotionally accessible at all times, physically monitored, and mentally aligned. Jennette grew up believing that this was normal parental love. She didn't know that most children weren't expected to share every detail of their inner world, or allow their privacy to be invaded under the justification of care. Deborah's illness made this closeness feel justified. When her health declined, the family rallied around her needs, and Jennette learned that sacrifice was love. But Deborah's definition of sacrifice was total. Jennette was expected to mold her life around her mother's anxieties, her routines, her fears, her rigid organization systems. Even mundane activities were controlled: what Jennette wore, how she spoke, what she enjoyed, and eventually, what she ate. Deborah framed it all as protection. Jennette saw it as love. Underneath Deborah's perfectionism lived a powerful insecurity. She obsessed over appearances, both physical and emotional. She taught Jennette to fear imperfection, hinting that any flaw might reflect poorly on the family or on Deborah's parenting. Jennette absorbed this pressure as quietly as she absorbed everything else. She learned that mistakes weren't something to learn from, they were something to hide. No matter how much Jennette accomplished, her mother's approval always felt conditional, something that could be withdrawn at the slightest misstep. In this emotional ecosystem, Jennette's sense of self-worth became dependent on being whatever her mother needed her to be. Deborah's illness intensified this dynamic. Every day could be her last. Every disappointment could trigger emotional collapse. Jennette responded by shrinking herself, avoiding conflict, and convincing herself that her mother's happiness was her responsibility. This belief would later fuel the most destructive behaviors of her life. Deborah's control wasn't expressed through screaming or overt rage. It was expressed through emotional intensity, manipulation, and a suffocating closeness disguised as maternal devotion. When Deborah cried, the whole house froze. When she smiled, everyone relaxed. Jennette learned to scan her mother's face for safety, like a weather pattern she needed to predict. This control shaped how Jennette viewed love. She believed love required sacrifice, closeness without boundaries, and the erasure of personal needs. She believed good daughters don't say no, they don't question, they don't pull away, even when the closeness hurts. Later, as an adult, Jennette would look back and understand the dynamic with clarity. Deborah didn't see Jennette for who she was. She saw her as an extension of her own unfulfilled dreams, fears, and identity. But as a child, Jennette only saw devotion. She didn't know that love was supposed to protect, not consume. Cluster 2 shows how foundation of emotional dependency was laid, how perfectionism became a survival skill, and how Jennette became someone trained to ignore her own needs, something that would shape the rest of her life. Cluster 3. The beginning of acting, auditions, pressure, and identity loss. Jennette McCurdy's introduction to acting did not come from a childhood dream or a natural pull toward performing. It came from her mother. Deborah had wanted to be an actress herself, but illness, instability, and circumstance stole that dream from her long before Jennette was born. When Jennette reached an age where she could be molded into that dream, Deborah saw her daughter not as a separate person, but as a second chance. Acting became Deborah's do-over, and Jennette became the vessel through which she hoped to reclaim something she felt she had lost. Jennette was not asked whether she wanted to act. It was decided for her. To Deborah, this wasn't pressure, it was love. She believed she was giving Jennette the life she never had. And Jennette, conditioned to believe that her mother's desires were her own, accepted this without question. She learned to equate compliance with love, success with approval, and performance with worth. Auditions quickly became the center of Jennette's childhood. They were not optional, and they were never simply opportunities. They were emotional exams. Every time she walked into a casting room, she carried the weight of her mother's dreams on her small shoulders. Deborah micromanaged her daughter's appearance, speech, posture, and expressions. Any deviation could ruin everything. Jennette learned to compress her personality into whatever shape the casting directors might want. She didn't yet understand that she was losing her sense of identity with every forced smile. Deborah's coaching was intense and invasive. She dictated how Jennette should speak, what emotions she should imitate, and how she should sell herself. If Jennette didn't succeed, Deborah responded with disappointment disguised as sadness. She didn't explode, she deflated. And for a child desperate for connection, that deflation was more painful than anger. Jennette felt responsible for her mother's joy and heartbreak. She became hyper-focused on avoiding mistakes and avoiding rejection, not from casting directors, but from her mother. Acting also intensified Deborah's obsession with image. Jennette's appearance became a project. Her hair, clothes, body, and expressions were all monitored. This created the early groundwork for Jennette's later struggles with body image and control, though she wouldn't understand this fully until after adolescence. Deborah's fixation wasn't framed as criticism, it was presented as care. She wanted Jennette to look her best. Jennette accepted this as normal mothering. As Jennette booked small roles, Deborah's enthusiasm intensified. She treated Jennette's accomplishments as collective victories, not Jennette's hard work, but Deborah's success as a mother. When Jennette failed, Deborah absorbed that too, not with blame, but with emotional collapse. Jennette grew up believing that her mother's emotional stability depended on her acting career. This created an impossible dynamic. Jennette was praised when she succeeded, but she was needed when she failed. Both dynamics trapped her. She could not escape her mother's emotional world whether she booked jobs or not. By the time Jennette reached her pre-teen years, acting was not simply an activity, it was her identity. Except it wasn't an identity she built, it was one assigned to her. She didn't yet know who she was. Outside performance, outside her mother's expectations, outside the hustle for casting calls, she had no private sense of self. Acting was not her dream, it was her reality, and it consumed everything else. Jennette's childhood became a tight pattern of pleasing, performing, adjusting, and suppressing her own discomfort. She learned that the world only valued certain versions of her, the cheerful, obedient, camera-ready versions, the versions that made her mother proud. She didn't know how to explore who she might be without the pressure. She didn't know she was allowed to want something different. Cluster 3 marks a critical point in Jennette's story, the beginning of a life lived entirely for someone else, under the illusion that it was her own dream. Cluster 4. Entering Hollywood. Nickelodeon, fame, and emotional collapse. Landing a Nickelodeon role was supposed to be the moment when everything worked. For Deborah, it was validation, proof that the years of auditions, rehearsals, manipulation, and sacrifice had finally paid off. For Jennette, it was something very different. She didn't feel excitement. She felt fear. She felt pressure. She felt a growing sense that she was stepping into a life she hadn't chosen, but now couldn't escape. Jennette was still a child when she entered the world of children's television, but she was already carrying adult-sized fear. Fame didn't amplify her confidence, it amplified her anxiety. She now had two demanding worlds to please, the industry and her mother. She learned to smile on set even when she felt numb inside. She learned to laugh during table reads even when she felt trapped. She learned that success meant ignoring herself. Nickelodeon presented itself as a fun, playful environment, bright colors, energetic scripts, a network centered on childhood joy. But Jennette's experience behind the scenes carried pressures most children never face. The demands of a high-profile kids show collided with her mother's emotional fragility and escalating control. Jennette now had supervisors, producers, directors, and an entire audience expecting her to perform perfectly. And at home, she had Deborah, whose identity was now completely bound to Jennette's fame. Jennette's mother monitored everything. Jennette's appearance, weight, career, emotions, and even her private life. She acted as if the production belonged to her, treating Jennette's career like a joint project. She celebrated every positive comment from producers as if she herself had earned it. When something went wrong, she treated it like a personal attack. Deborah's emotional highs and lows intensified alongside Jennette's rising fame. The dynamic became suffocating. Deborah visited the set frequently, inserting herself into decisions and presenting herself as the unstoppable force behind Jennette's success. Jennette internalized the message that her worth, her mother's happiness, the family's financial stability, the network's approval depended on her performance. Fame didn't free her. It locked her deeper into a pattern of self-erasure. Jennette also faced pressures that no child should have to manage. There were expectations about maturity, professionalism, appearance, and emotional composure. Expectations normally placed on adults. Jennette had to deal with inappropriate behavior from powerful adults, creative demands she had no control over, and a system that treated children like products. She couldn't speak up. She couldn't refuse. She was taught to believe that objections were signs of ungratefulness. Behind the scenes, Jennette's emotional and physical health were already starting to deteriorate. She struggled with overwhelming anxiety, identity confusion, and a growing disconnect between who she was and who she was forced to be. The applause from fans and attention from media only deepened this disconnect. Everyone loved the character she played, but Jennette knew that wasn't her. It wasn't even a version she had chosen. She felt like she was performing all day and performing at home, too. Her mother's presence at work ensured that Jennette's professional world offered no escape. Deborah demanded constant updates, approval, and access. She monitored Jennette's interactions with castmates, questioned producers, and acted as if her daughter's fame validated her worth as a mother. Jennette was trapped between needing her mother's approval and fearing her reactions. Fame also intensified Deborah's control over Jennette's body, her eating, and her image. Jennette was constantly reminded that the public eye was on her. She was trained to believe that the slightest deviation, gaining weight, changing her appearance, expressing independence, could destroy her career. This environment contributed directly to the disordered behaviors Jennette later battled intensely. But, at the time, she didn't see them as disordered. She saw them as normal, as required, as an extension of the control she'd lived under since childhood. As her visibility increased, Jennette's inner world deteriorated. She became more anxious, more conflicted, more disconnected from her emotions. She was surrounded by millions of fans but felt deeply alone. Every day, she put on a character for the world and another character for her mother, leaving no place for her actual self. Fame did not elevate her. It crushed her beneath expectations she could never meet. Cluster 4 reveals a crucial truth. Jennette entered Hollywood as a child already burdened by emotional responsibility, and the industry magnified that burden tenfold. Fame didn't save her. It amplified the cracks that had been forming since childhood. Cluster 5, eating disorders, trauma bonds, and emotional dependency. Jennette McCurdy's struggles with eating disorders did not emerge suddenly. They were the direct result of years spent internalizing her mother's anxieties, expectations, and distorted beliefs about control, appearance, and worth. What Jennette endured was not a single moment of harm, but the gradual shaping of a worldview in which her body was not her own. It belonged to the ambitions, fears, and needs of someone else. Deborah's influence over Jennette's eating began subtly, wrapped in the language of care, protection, and maternal guidance. But underneath that language existed a system of control so complete that Jennette never learned to understand hunger, bodily autonomy, or boundaries as normal human experiences. Her mother monitored what she ate, when she ate, how she looked, and how her body was developing. Jennette absorbed these lessons as unquestioned truths. For Jennette, eating was never simply eating. It was a performance. It was an act done to maintain her mother's approval. It was a ritual controlled from the outside. She learned to associate food with anxiety, expectations, and judgment. The idea that her own body could belong to her, that she could make independent decisions about it, did not exist in her early world. Deborah framed her surveillance as love. She insisted she wanted Jennette to look her best for auditions. She taught her to fear weight gain as a threat to her career. And because childhood had taught Jennette that pleasing her mother was the only path to safety, she accepted this distorted guidance as correct. She didn't see danger, she saw devotion. This parental influence created what psychologists call a trauma bond, a deep emotional connection built not through healthy attachment, but through cycles of dependency, fear, and conditional love. Jennette's emotional survival depended on maintaining closeness with her mother, even when that closeness harmed her. She couldn't question Deborah's demands without feeling she was betraying her. And because Deborah's health was always fragile, confronting her felt unthinkable. Jennette's acting career further intensified these issues. Hollywood was a world obsessed with image, and Deborah used the industry's expectations as justification for increasing control. Jennette felt pressure from all directions. She was told, implicitly and explicitly, that her body was an asset, that it needed managing, that its worth was tied to how others viewed it. These messages aligned painfully well with her mother's worldview. Under these combined forces, Jennette's relationship with food and her body spiraled. She began to adopt unhealthy behaviors that gave her a sense of relief, control, or emotional numbness, not because she wanted to harm herself, but because these behaviors felt like the only tools available to cope with feelings she had never been taught to understand. Jennette's eating disorder became both a symptom and a survival mechanism, a way to quiet anxiety, a way to feel something she could control in a life where everything else was dictated to her, a way to maintain the identity her mother demanded, and a way to cope with the overwhelming emotional weight she carried daily. What makes Jennette's story especially heartbreaking is how normal it all seemed to her at the time. She didn't view her behaviors as symptoms of illness or trauma. She viewed them as expected, as part of the role she was supposed to play, both on screen and at home. This normalization is one of the most damaging effects of childhood emotional manipulation. When a child is taught that harmful conditions are normal, they grow into an adult who struggles to recognize danger. The emotional dependency between Jennette and her mother also intensified her eating disorder. Deborah showered Jennette with approval when she looked small, when she seemed obedient, when she followed rules without questioning. But this approval was fragile. It could disappear instantly if Jennette showed independence or resistance. Jennette learned to associate physical thinness with emotional closeness. That connection is profoundly damaging, yet tragically common in children raised by controlling parents. Even as Jennette's career grew, internally she felt herself shrinking. She became more disconnected from her own feelings and needs. She prioritized emotional survival over physical well-being. She lived in a constant state of tension, wanting to be the daughter her mother needed, wanting to maintain her career, and wanting to suppress the growing voice inside her that whispered that something was terribly wrong. This cluster marks a significant turning point. Jennette's body became the battleground for the conflict between who she was and who her mother demanded she be. Her eating disorder was not a choice. It was the inevitable outcome of years spent in an environment where emotional control, perfectionism, and fear replaced nurture, safety, and autonomy. Cluster 6: Teen Stardom, Success, and Growing Internal Conflict. As Jennette entered her teenage years, her fame expanded quickly. What began as scattered roles and small appearances turned into full-time stardom. Millions of children and teenagers knew her face, mimicked her lines, and saw her as bubbly, funny, and effortlessly charming. The world perceived her as someone living a dream. But the truth was that Jennette was living a life she hadn't chosen. A life constructed by her mother and reinforced by an industry built on performance, pressure, and image. On the outside, Jennette appeared to be thriving. She was recognized everywhere. She was making money that adults twice her age could only hope for. She was working on popular shows, surrounded by a production machine that treated her like a star. But inside, she felt increasingly hollow. The larger the audience grew, the smaller she felt within herself. Because Jennette's identity had always been shaped by external expectations, she didn't know how to handle the disconnect between who she truly was and who she was required to be. Fans saw a confident teenager. Her mother saw a product finally reaching its potential. Hollywood saw a marketable child star. Jennette saw none of these things in herself. She saw a girl who was drowning in roles, scripts, and obligations, with no pause to understand her emotions. This inner conflict worsened as her mother's control intensified. Deborah monitored Jennette's friendships, interactions, decisions, appearance, and reactions to fame. Jennette's increasing visibility meant that Deborah tightened her grip, anxious about losing influence. She inserted herself into every possible aspect of Jennette's professional life, desperate to maintain the illusion that she and Jennette were a united team. But this team was not built on partnership. It was built on Jennette's compliance. Behind closed doors, the imbalance in their relationship grew more unstable. Deborah's fears, insecurities, and emotional volatility increasingly influenced Jennette's choices. Jennette still believed she was responsible for protecting her mother's feelings. She still internalized the idea that pleasing her mother was a duty, not an option. Even as she matured physically and mentally, she felt emotionally frozen, like a child who could not afford to upset her parent. As Jennette's fame soared, so did her sense of fragmented identity. She started to realize she had no personal preferences independent of her mother's influence. She didn't know what she genuinely liked, disliked, wanted, or felt. Even basic decisions, what to wear, how to look, how to speak, felt predetermined by others. She began to sense a growing void inside herself, a hollow space where individuality should have been. At the same time, her eating disorder deepened. The emotional strain of fame, combined with the pressures at home, made her more reliant on restrictive behaviors that offered a brief illusion of control. These behaviors provided a momentary release from the chaos around her, but they also isolated her further, emotionally and psychologically. Instead of sharing her struggles, she hid them, from colleagues, friends, and even from herself. Shame blended with denial. Jennette convinced herself she was managing fine, but internally, she felt fragile, exhausted, and trapped in cycles she didn't understand. Her teenage years brought new responsibilities that made the emotional strain even heavier. She had to navigate adult conversations at work while being treated as a child at home. She had to perform confidence for audiences while feeling insecure in her private life. She had to pretend success felt good when it actually felt suffocating. The mismatch between outer expectations and inner reality was tearing her apart. Jennette also began noticing the darker parts of the industry. Older authority figures behaving inappropriately, manipulative dynamics disguised as mentorship, and environments where saying no felt dangerous. Her emotional vulnerability made her an easy target for exploitation, and she often felt scared, confused, and powerless. Yet she continued performing through these experiences, believing she had no choice. Her entire world had taught her that discomfort didn't matter, only obedience did. As time passed, Jennette felt loneliness deepen. Fame brought attention, but it didn't bring understanding. She couldn't reveal her true emotions without risking criticism or triggering her mother's collapse. She learned to compartmentalize, to smile publicly while suffering privately. This emotional splitting took a toll. Jennette's anxiety intensified, her body image deteriorated, and her ability to recognize her own needs shrank even further. Cluster 6 reveals a devastating truth. Jennette achieved the success her mother dreamed of, but success only magnified the cracks inside her. The more the world celebrated her, the more invisible she felt to herself. Cluster 7, the breaking point before her mother's death. As Jennette approached the final years of her childhood and teen stardom, the emotional tension that had been tightening for so long reached a point where it could no longer stretch. Her life had become a pattern of survival, not physical survival, but emotional endurance. Every year added new layers of pressure, expectation, confusion, and fear, and Jennette carried all of it silently. She believed she had no right to feel overwhelmed. After all, she was successful, lucky, and constantly reminded of opportunities others would envy. But emotional suffering does not disappear under success. It grows beneath it. Her mother's illness worsened during this period, which made the emotional environment at home even more volatile. Deborah's fragility intensified, and her need for control deepened. Jennette felt trapped between two extremes: a career demanding constant performance and a home demanding constant emotional obedience. There was no place in her life where she could exhale, think, or explore her own identity. Every moment revolved around someone else's needs. Jennette's eating disorder grew more severe as these pressures accumulated. While I cannot describe harmful behavior in graphic or instructional detail, it is important to express the emotional reality. Jennette's relationship with food and her body became a desperate attempt to find control in a life where she had none. Her behaviors were not vanity, rebellion, or a desire for attention. They were coping mechanisms shaped by years of parental control, industry pressure, and emotional suppression. They allowed her to silence fear, guilt, and confusion, temporarily. Meanwhile, Hollywood's demands became heavier. The more successful Jennette became, the less freedom she felt. Shooting schedules were intense, public scrutiny sharpened, and every interview required her to project a confidence she did not feel. Jennette's anxiety surged. Off camera, she was emotionally unraveling. On camera, she was expected to shine. What made this period especially painful was that Jennette began to sense, in small, quiet moments, that something about her life was deeply wrong. She began noticing contradictions in her mother's behavior. She felt uneasy about the pressure placed on her. She questioned, silently, privately, why she couldn't make simple choices for herself. These realizations were small, but they were significant. They signaled the beginning of an inner shift, the first sparks of self-awareness. Yet Jennette could not act on these feelings. Her trauma bond with her mother was too strong. Deborah's approval still held the highest emotional weight in her life. Even when something felt wrong, Jennette blamed herself. She assumed she was ungrateful or dramatic. She convinced herself her discomfort was a personal flaw, not a symptom of manipulation and emotional abuse. Deborah's emotional instability intensified as her health declined. She became more anxious, demanding, and unpredictable. Jennette stepped deeper into the caretaker role she had held since childhood. She monitored her mother's moods, absorbed her emotional pain, and tried desperately to keep peace in a household collapsing under stress. In this era, Jennette often felt more like a parent than a child. The pressure of being both a caretaker and a celebrity teenager was emotionally crushing. Jennette experienced increasing panic, dissociation, and exhaustion. Her eating disorder escalated in response, becoming a silent scream for relief. She hid her suffering because she feared burdening her mother and disappointing the world. Jennette also faced growing discomfort with certain adults in the industry. Boundaries were crossed that should never have been crossed, and she often felt unsafe, but unable to speak out. She had been raised to obey, to endure, to never question authority. These learned behaviors stripped her of the ability to advocate for herself, even in moments where she sensed danger. Meanwhile, Deborah's illness created a new layer of emotional pressure: guilt. Jennette felt she needed to stay physically close, emotionally available, and endlessly supportive because she feared losing her mother. Every request from Deborah carried the weight of mortality. Jennette rationalized her own suffering by telling herself, "At least Mom is still here. I should be grateful." As the end of this era approached, Jennette was emotionally depleted. She had no sense of self outside of her mother's identity and the character she played on television. She lived with constant fear: fear of disappointing her mother, fear of losing her career, fear of acknowledging the truth about her emotional pain. The breaking point was not one single event. It was years of accumulated strain finally reaching their limit. Jennette entered young adulthood carrying trauma she couldn't fully comprehend, locked inside a life that looked successful from the outside but felt suffocating from the inside. Cluster 7 ends at the threshold of a major shift, the moment before her mother's death, when Jennette's world stood on the edge of collapse. The life she had always known was about to disappear, and with it, the only version of herself she had ever been allowed to be. We will continue with Section 2 after, and his 7 clusters. The first cluster, after her mother's death: shock, freedom, and guilt. Jennette McCurdy's mother died in 2013 after a long battle with cancer. The moment her mother passed should have brought closure, relief, or a straightforward sense of grief. At least, that's what Jennette expected of herself. Instead, she felt something far more complicated: a mixture of sorrow, numbness, and a kind of disorienting emotional freedom she didn't know how to handle. Her entire identity had been built around pleasing her mother, anticipating her mother's needs, and shaping her life around her mother's illness and ambitions. When that anchor disappeared, Jennette was left floating in a void. She had no internal structure to rely on, no sense of who she was, what she liked, or what she valued. Her personality had been constructed in response to her mother. Without her mother's presence, even her ordinary daily choices felt unfamiliar. Jennette also felt guilt. Not just ordinary grief guilt, but guilt that came from deeply conditioned obedience. She felt guilty for being alive when her mother was not. Guilty for even momentary relief. Guilty for feeling anything other than pure devastation. She had been trained to believe her mother's emotions were more important than her own, and that belief did not vanish when Deborah died. Jennette still heard her mother's voice in her head, guiding her reactions, shaping her emotions, and judging her responses. In the days and weeks after her mother's death, Jennette found herself acting the way she had been conditioned to act: performing. She cried at expected moments, reassured people she was fine, and behaved like someone grieving in the right way. But internally, she felt emotionally paralyzed. She couldn't differentiate between genuine sadness and the sadness she felt obligated to display. She didn't know which emotions were hers and which were inherited from her mother's expectations. The most disorienting feeling was freedom, a freedom she never asked for and didn't know what to do with. Deborah had controlled every part of Jennette's life, from her body to her career. Without that control, Jennette realized she had no idea how to make decisions. Even simple choices, like what clothes to wear or what food to eat, felt overwhelming. She had spent her entire life being told what to do. Now she had to construct herself from scratch. But freedom also brought fear. Without her mother's voice dictating her every move, Jennette felt exposed. She feared making the wrong choices. She feared disappointing an authority figure who was no longer alive. She feared confronting emotions she had suppressed her entire life. And she feared the truth, that her mother's death revealed a painful reality. She didn't know who she was without someone telling her who to be. At the same time, Jennette experienced a strange sense of emotional quiet. For the first time, the constant pressure to manage her mother's moods was gone. The household atmosphere she grew up in, charged, anxious, unpredictable, vanished instantly. Jennette didn't know how to process that silence. She didn't realize until then how deeply her nervous system had been trained for crisis. This mixture of grief, release, confusion, guilt, and numbness was not a clean emotional arc. It was chaos. Jennette stepped into adulthood carrying the weight of her mother's legacy, the burden of trauma, and the enormous pressure of redefining herself without the only emotional compass she had ever known, even if that compass had led her into harm. Cluster 1 sets the stage for the emotional journey of Section 2. Jennette enters adulthood with trauma, freedom, and grief tangled into a single knot, one she will spend years learning how to unravel. Cluster 2, grief, denial, and the collapse of identity. In the months following her mother's death, Jennette entered a psychological landscape that was far more chaotic than she expected. She had imagined grief as a clean arc, an emotional wound that would hurt intensely and then heal over time. Instead, grief arrived in fragmented pieces. Some days, it was overwhelming. Other days, it felt distant. And in many moments, Jennette's overwhelming reaction was something she did not dare admit to anyone. She didn't feel what she thought she was supposed to feel. For a child raised to prioritize her mother's emotions above her own, this disconnect created fear and shame. Jennette expected to mourn her mother fully and consistently. She expected the world to stop. She expected emotional devastation to define every waking moment. Instead, her grief was inconsistent, unpredictable, and confusing. She cried when others cried. She comforted her family. She performed grief the way she had performed everything else in her life. But privately, she felt a quiet hollowness, the kind that comes not from a lack of care, but from years of emotional suppression. Jennette had not been taught how to feel independently. She had been taught how to react in ways that kept her mother stable. Now, stripped of that role, she didn't know how to access her own authentic emotional responses. She wasn't numb because she didn't love her mother. She was numb because she had never been allowed to process feelings without supervision, commentary, or correction. This numbness pushed her into a form of emotional denial. She told herself she was fine even when she wasn't. She convinced herself she didn't need help, even as her mind spiraled between sorrow, confusion, and guilt. She avoided thinking critically about her childhood, terrified that doing so might bring up painful truths she wasn't ready to confront. Instead, she clung to the idealized version of her mother, the version she had been trained to see, the version of Deborah as loving, protective, self-sacrificing, and heroic. But as time passed, cracks began to appear in that idealized memory. Jennette started recalling moments that felt uncomfortable in hindsight. Moments of control disguised as affection, manipulation framed as care, invasiveness presented as devotion. She tried to push these memories away. It felt disloyal, even dangerous, to question her mother's actions. Jennette feared that acknowledging the harm she endured meant betraying the woman she spent her life trying to protect. Yet her mind kept circling back. The more distance she gained from Deborah's presence, the more Jennette began to recognize how much of her personality had been shaped and limited by her mother's fears and demands. What she had once considered normal began to feel concerning. What she had once accepted as love began to reveal threads of control. This realization didn't arrive in a single moment. It unfolded slowly, almost reluctantly. Jennette wrestled with two conflicting truths. 1. She loved her mother deeply. 2. Her mother had caused enormous harm. Holding both truths at once felt impossible. Jennette fluctuated between protecting her mother in memory and feeling quietly angry about the things she had endured. Because she had never been allowed to experience anger as a child, even recognizing it in herself was frightening. Anger felt like a betrayal. Grief felt like a test, and trying to balance both became emotionally exhausting. At the same time, her identity began collapsing. Jennette realized that without her mother's voice directing her life, she had no idea what she wanted. She didn't have hobbies. She didn't have preferences. She didn't have a sense of purpose outside of acting. And even that career had been chosen for her, not by her. She felt like a blank slate, but not in a liberating way. More like someone who had lost the script she'd memorized her entire life. To cope with this disorientation, Jennette leaned harder into denial. She tried to keep busy, keep performing, keep up the appearance of stability. She assured others that she was okay. But internally, she felt like she was unraveling. She didn't know how to mourn properly, how to process trauma, or how to rebuild an identity from nothing. This cluster captures the emotional reality of early grief. Jennette wasn't just grieving the loss of her mother. She was grieving the loss of the identity her mother had built for her. The collapse of that identity left her emotionally unmoored, unable to move forward but terrified of looking back. Cluster 3. Escalation of eating disorders and emotional numbness. In the years following her mother's death, Jennette's eating disorders intensified in ways she did not fully recognize at the time. The behaviors she had been conditioned into since childhood, rituals disguised as care, restrictions disguised as discipline, habits disguised as protection, took on a life of their own. Without her mother actively controlling her food, Jennette was left with a deeply fractured sense of bodily autonomy. Her mother's voice had been the one constant shaping her eating habits. And when that voice vanished, Jennette was left with the echoes. These echoes were not gentle. They were demanding, judgmental, and intrusive. They were the internalized remnants of years of supervision, pressure, and emotional conditioning. Jennette found herself continuing the same restrictive patterns, not because she wanted to harm herself, but because she had never learned another way to relate to her body. She didn't know what normal eating looked like. She didn't know how to interpret hunger. She didn't know how to care for herself outside of the framework her mother had established. Her eating disorder escalated as a response to emotional overload. Jennette was grieving, confused, overwhelmed, and suddenly fully responsible for choices she had never been allowed to make. The disordered behaviors that had once been encouraged now became her only coping mechanism. They allowed her to numb difficult emotions, silence anxiety, and maintain a sense of order in a life that felt increasingly chaotic. But these behaviors carried heavy emotional consequences. Jennette became more isolated, not physically, but mentally. She withdrew into patterns of secrecy and self-surveillance. She monitored herself the way her mother once monitored her, holding herself to impossible standards. When she slipped, she punished herself emotionally. When she succeeded in controlling her intake, she felt a fleeting sense of pride, a pride that came from years of being rewarded for shrinking. This emotional cycle deepened her numbness. Jennette found that maintaining strict control over her food also suppressed her ability to feel grief. It quieted anger. It pushed away the rising discomfort she felt when she remembered certain childhood experiences with new clarity. The eating disorder became the emotional buffer that allowed her to avoid facing truths she wasn't ready to acknowledge. Without it, she feared she would collapse under the weight of everything she had buried. Meanwhile, the outside world saw success. She continued acting. She maintained her public persona. She looked put together and professional. But internally, she felt lost. Her eating disorder carved out a space where emotions couldn't reach her. It became a refuge from memories that were beginning to resurface. Memories that raised painful questions about her mother's behavior and the environment she grew up in. Jennette's relationships during this time also reflected her emotional numbness. She often struggled to connect authentically because she didn't know herself. She didn't know what she wanted, what she feared, or what she believed. She worried constantly about being a burden. She said yes when she wanted to say no. She mirrored others' expectations because she didn't have a stable internal identity to anchor herself to. The trauma bond she had lived in for so long had left her with a deep fear of abandonment and a deeply distorted sense of self-worth. As her disordered behaviors escalated, Jennette also became more disconnected from the world around her. She went through motions, filming, socializing superficially, fulfilling obligations, but rarely felt present. Daily life became a script. She played the role of a functioning adult while quietly unraveling. One of the most painful truths of this period is that Jennette didn't fully understand she was suffering. The behaviors that harmed her were so ingrained that they felt normal. She believed she was simply doing what she had been taught. She believed she was maintaining discipline. She didn't yet know that she was reenacting the emotional control her mother had exerted over her. She didn't yet know that the disorder was not about food at all. It was about trauma, identity, and the weight of grief. This cluster captures the reality of her situation. Jennette wasn't spiraling because she was weak. She was spiraling because she had never been taught how to live without someone monitoring, controlling, and defining her. The eating disorder became the only structure she had left, even as it slowly consumed her from the inside. Cluster 4: Career Confusion, Hollywood Disillusionment, and Breaking Away. In the years following her mother's death, Jennette experienced a dramatic shift in how she viewed her career. Acting had always been something she did for her mother, a role she performed to make Deborah proud, to fulfill her mother's lost dreams, and to maintain peace at home. Without her mother's constant presence, Jennette began to feel the emptiness behind the work she once considered mandatory. Acting no longer felt like purpose. It felt like a relic of a life that no longer existed. But leaving Hollywood wasn't simple. The industry had shaped her identity as much as her mother had. Jennette had spent her childhood growing up on sets, learning to please directors, adapt to characters, and hide her true emotions behind whatever the scene required. She knew how to perform, not how to live. And in her early adulthood, she was still surrounded by people who associated her with the bubbly character she played, rather than the person she truly was. This disconnect became increasingly painful. Jennette found herself on projects that no longer made her feel anything. Not joy, not pride, not fulfillment. She felt like she was acting out a version of her life she didn't choose. The roles she played, the scripts she read, the expectations placed upon her. All of it reminded her of her mother's influence. Every audition, every callback, every set was haunted by a voice she could no longer hear but still felt everywhere. Hollywood itself began to feel more suffocating. She began noticing how little agency she'd ever had in this world. She remembered the uncomfortable situations with authority figures. The imbalance of power she once normalized now felt alarming. The pressure to look a certain way, speak a certain way, behave a certain way, all of it felt artificial and unsafe. Jennette realized she had been operating under emotional survival mode for so long that she had never stopped to question the industry itself. As she gained distance from her mother's control, she began to question the structures that had shaped her career. Why had she accepted so many situations where she felt uncomfortable? Why had she tolerated the disregard for boundaries that should have been protected? Why had she continued performing even when it hurt her? The truth was painful, because she had never been taught she was allowed to say no. As a result, Jennette's disillusionment grew. Fame had never healed her. It had never brought her happiness. It had only intensified the emotional fractures she carried from childhood. The more she saw Hollywood through the eyes of a free adult instead of a controlled child, the more she realized the industry had benefited from her compliance. And now that she was no longer a fearful child eager to please, she began to recognize that she didn't belong there anymore. At the same time, Jennette's emotional world was deteriorating. Stress and confusion deepened her eating disorder. Anxiety consumed her daily life. She struggled to form genuine connections. Her relationships often mirrored the dependency patterns she learned from her mother, seeking approval, fearing abandonment, losing herself in others. Acting no longer provided structure or stability. Instead, it intensified the emptiness she felt. Jennette began contemplating a life outside of Hollywood, a thought that felt both liberating and terrifying. For the first time, she asked herself what she wanted, not what her mother wanted, not what fans wanted, not what producers wanted. And the answer, when she allowed herself to admit it, startled her. She didn't want to act anymore. This realization didn't come with celebration. It came with grief. Acting had consumed her entire childhood. Leaving it felt like losing a part of herself, or rather, losing a part of the identity she had been forced to adopt. It meant stepping into the unknown, a place where she had no instructions, no external approval, and no guaranteed sense of belonging. Hollywood had been a prison, but it had also been a home. Breaking away meant Jennette had to confront the emotional void left behind. It meant facing fears she had buried, memories she had avoided, and truths she wasn't sure she was ready to understand. But it also meant reclaiming agency for the first time in her life. Cluster 4 captures this turning point. Jennette wasn't simply leaving a career. She was stepping out of an identity built for her by others, finally beginning to question everything she had once accepted without hesitation. Cluster 5. Relationships, dependency, and repeating old patterns. After her mother's death and the gradual unraveling of her acting career, Jennette entered a period of life shaped by an intense search for connection, a search heavily influenced by the trauma bond she had developed in childhood. Because she had been raised in an environment where love equaled compliance, closeness equaled obligation, and affection was conditional, Jennette carried those beliefs into her adult relationships. She did not choose relationships based on compatibility, care, or mutual respect. She gravitated toward dynamics that felt familiar, even when that familiarity was harmful. Jennette found herself repeatedly drawn to people who mirrored aspects of her mother's emotional intensity. She wasn't looking for someone controlling, but subconsciously, control felt like closeness. She wasn't seeking people who dismissed her needs, but dismissal felt normal. She wasn't intentionally choosing instability, but her nervous system recognized instability as home. In several relationships, Jennette slipped into patterns where she lost her sense of identity. She molded herself to match what others wanted, just as she had done with her mother. She suppressed her emotions to keep peace. She ignored discomfort to avoid conflict. She surrendered autonomy because autonomy had always felt dangerous, as if asserting herself would lead to abandonment or disappointment. This wasn't weakness, it was survival programming. Jennette had spent her entire childhood learning to prioritize someone else's emotional world over her own. When she entered relationships as an adult, that training influenced every decision she made. She believed she had to be easy, agreeable, and self-sacrificing to be loved. She believed her needs were burdens. She believed love required endurance, not boundaries. Because she had never been taught healthy models of intimacy, Jennette didn't recognize unhealthy patterns as red flags. She saw them as relationship norms. She interpreted discomfort as her fault. She convinced herself that if she just worked harder, if she pleased more, sacrificed more, apologized more, the relationship would stabilize. This mirrored her unspoken contract with her mother: keep the other person emotionally satisfied at any cost. Her sense of worth was so tied to being needed that she gravitated toward people who wanted emotional caretaking. She became the therapist, the fixer, the emotionally responsible one. The dynamic was draining, but also familiar. Being needed felt safe. Being independent felt terrifying. Alongside these relational struggles, Jennette's internal world remained chaotic. Her eating disorder continued to deepen during this period, especially as she navigated painful breakups, shame, and feelings of inadequacy. While I cannot describe harmful behaviors, I can state the emotional truth. Jennette used restrictive and compulsive patterns to cope with emotional pain she was not ready to face directly. The eating disorder functioned like an emotional buffer. It numbed heartbreak, silenced fear, and offered temporary control. Jennette also carried deep insecurity into her relationships. She feared being too much, too emotional, too damaged, too complicated. She feared that her past made her unlovable. She often stayed silent about her needs, convinced that asking for emotional support would make people leave. This silence created distance, misunderstandings, and loneliness, even when she was partnered. Complicating this further, Jennette sometimes sought validation from partners in ways that mirrored her childhood patterns, seeking reassurance, approval, or guidance instead of mutual connection. She relied on relationships to fill the void her mother had left behind. But no partner could fill that void because the void itself was not about romance. It was about identity. Jennette didn't yet understand that healing required self-connection, not external rescue. Her romantic relationships also revealed an important truth. Even when you leave an unhealthy environment, its patterns follow you until you confront them. Jennette had left her mother's control physically, But emotionally, she was still navigating the world with the same beliefs she had learned in childhood. This was not her fault. It was the natural outcome of years of conditioning. Some relationships brought temporary comfort, even tenderness. But the weight of unresolved trauma often led to ruptures. Breaking up felt as painful as disappointing her mother had felt, as if losing a relationship meant losing the center of her emotional stability. Each breakup intensified her internal emptiness, pushing her deeper into numbness, disordered coping, and denial. Yet within these painful cycles, something important was happening. Jennette was slowly gathering the emotional data she needed to see the truth. Her struggles in relationships were not about the partners themselves, but about the unhealed wounds she carried from her mother. Each pattern repeated itself because she had not yet learned how to replace those patterns with healthier ones. Cluster 5 marks a major turning point. Jennette began recognizing that the common factor in her relational pain wasn't failure. It was trauma. And trauma, once recognized, can finally be addressed. Cluster 6. Therapy, reckoning, and breaking the trauma bond. Jennette's decision to enter therapy didn't happen in one clear moment. It came at the end of a long stretch of emotional exhaustion, the kind that accumulates slowly, almost invisibly, until the mind can't maintain the illusion of stability any longer. She was overwhelmed by anxiety, depleted by her eating disorder, and stuck in repeated relational patterns she could not understand. The life she was living felt disconnected from the life she wanted, and she didn't yet know who she was beneath the coping mechanisms she had built since childhood. She went to therapy because she sensed something had to change, even if she didn't know what that change should be. At first, therapy felt foreign. Jennette had spent her entire childhood being told what to feel, how to behave, and how to interpret her experiences. Therapy required the opposite: honesty, introspection, and the courage to articulate emotions she had never been allowed to have. She entered each session carrying more self-blame than self-understanding. She often minimized her struggles, dismissed her pain, or tried to present herself as fine. These habits were not resistance. They were survival tactics she had learned from living under her mother's emotional expectations. But her therapist gently challenged these deeply rooted beliefs. For the first time, Jennette encountered someone who did not reinforce her mother's narrative, someone who didn't expect performance, someone who asked questions that paused her internal scripts, someone who didn't want her to be perfect, obedient, or self-sacrificing, someone who wasn't shocked by her pain, who didn't romanticize her mother, and who didn't dismiss her experiences as exaggerations. These sessions began revealing truths Jennette had long buried. Memories she once interpreted as love now looked like manipulation. Moments she once saw as protection now resembled control. Behaviors she normalized now appeared harmful. Jennette was forced to confront a devastating realization: her mother had emotionally abused her. This was not a conclusion she reached easily. It shattered the foundation of her identity. She had spent her entire life protecting her mother, shaping herself around her mother's needs, and believing that obedience was love. Admitting the truth felt like betrayal. But therapy helped her understand something crucial: acknowledging abuse is not betrayal. It is healing. She began to see that her mother's actions were rooted in her own unhealed fears, insecurities, and mental instability. Understanding this did not erase the harm, but it replaced confusion with clarity. Jennette wasn't a bad daughter. She had been a controlled child. This shift didn't happen instantly. It came in fragments. Some sessions left her drained, while others left her enlightened. Some weeks, she clung to the idealized version of her mother, resisting the painful truths. Other weeks, she allowed herself to feel anger, an emotion she had never been permitted to express. Anger scared her at first. It felt dangerous. But eventually, she learned that anger wasn't a threat. It was information. Anger showed her where her boundaries had been violated, where her needs had been ignored, and where her identity had been restricted. As Jennette processed these truths, her eating disorder also came into focus in a new way. It was not vanity or discipline. It was trauma manifesting physically. It was a coping mechanism born from emotional control. Jennette realized that her mother had equated thinness with worth, compliance with love, and self-denial with loyalty. These messages had shaped her relationship with her body so deeply that she couldn't separate her mother's voice from her own self-talk. Therapy helped her unlearn this programming. Slowly, she developed language for her experiences. She learned how to name emotions like guilt, anger, sadness, and fear. Emotions she had always felt but had never been allowed to articulate. She began to see how her past shaped her present behaviors, why she froze in conflict, why she sought approval from emotionally demanding people, why boundaries felt terrifying, and why independence felt unnatural. One of the most painful breakthroughs came when Jennette confronted the trauma bond with her mother. She realized that the attachment she felt wasn't love alone. It was fear, conditioning, obligation, and emotional dependency woven together. This bond had trapped her in cycles of self-blame, shame, and denial. Breaking it meant grieving not only the loss of her mother, but the loss of the mother she wished she had. Healing required accepting a truth she had avoided her entire life. Her mother had not given her the tools to love herself. She had given her the tools to fear herself. As Jennette continued therapy, she began rebuilding herself from the inside out. Piece by piece, she examined the beliefs she had inherited. Piece by piece, she learned to trust her emotions. Piece by piece, she learned to question what love actually meant. And for the first time, she started making decisions based on her own needs, not someone else's. Cluster 6 marks a monumental turning point. Jennette stopped surviving for someone else and began living for herself, through truth, through grief, and through the slow, painful process of reclaiming her identity. Cluster 7, reclaiming herself. Identity, recovery, and writing the book. Jennette's healing did not come in a single revelation, nor did it unfold in a clean, linear arc. Recovery was messy, uncomfortable, and non-linear, full of steps forward and steps back, clarity followed by confusion, progress tangled with fear. But slowly, through therapy, honesty, and painful self-reflection, Jennette began reclaiming the parts of herself she had never been allowed to develop. Her adulthood became an emotional excavation, uncovering the buried self beneath layers of trauma, expectations, and survival mechanisms. One of the first major shifts came when Jennette finally allowed herself to acknowledge the breadth of her mother's impact. Through therapy, she learned that naming the harm her mother caused was not an attack on her mother. It was an act of integrity toward herself. She learned that love and abuse can coexist, and that acknowledging the abuse does not cancel the love. It simply exposes the truth so healing can begin. With this painful clarity, Jennette began disentangling her identity from her mother's influence. She started making decisions based on what she wanted, a concept that once felt terrifying and unnatural. She experimented with new interests, explored hobbies she had never been allowed to consider, and made choices about her appearance, routines, and lifestyle without imagining how her mother might react. Each small decision felt monumental because each one reclaimed a bit of her autonomy. Her relationship with her body also began to shift. While the eating disorder did not disappear instantly, it rarely works that way. Jennette slowly began understanding its emotional roots. She learned to see the disorder as a reflection of the control her mother exerted over her, not as a weakness or personal failure. She learned to treat her struggles with compassion instead of shame. She learned to separate her own needs from the demands that had once dominated her childhood. Jennette also began reevaluating her career. She had spent her entire life acting, but not once had she chosen it for herself. As this realization settled into her consciousness, she understood that leaving Hollywood was not giving up. It was liberation. It was a refusal to continue living a life built from someone else's dream. Stepping away from acting was one of the most courageous decisions Jennette ever made, because it required letting go of an identity that had defined her since childhood, but never belonged to her. The decision opened space for something new: writing. Jennette discovered that writing gave her a voice she never had. For the first time, she could express her thoughts without performing them. She could share her emotions without filtering them through someone else's expectations. Writing allowed her to reclaim the narrative of her life, something she had never controlled before. She wrote without worrying about approval. She wrote without fearing that honesty would cause emotional collapse. She wrote because she needed to understand her story in order to heal. At first, writing felt chaotic. Memories surfaced in fragments. Jennette struggled with self-doubt, fearing that her truth was invalid or unworthy. But therapy helped her see that her experiences mattered, that her pain was real, and that her voice was powerful. The more she wrote, the more clarity she found. The more honesty she allowed herself, the more she understood the connection between her childhood, her trauma, her eating disorder, and her identity struggles. As she wrote, Jennette experienced grief in new ways. She grieved the childhood she never had, the autonomy she never developed, the boundaries she was never allowed to form. She grieved the version of her mother she had hoped for but never received. She grieved the girl she had been, the girl who tried so hard, worked so hard, suffered so quietly, and believed for so long that love meant self-erasure. But grief, as painful as it was, became a catalyst for rebirth. By acknowledging what she had lost, Jennette created space to imagine what she could gain. She learned that healing doesn't mean forgetting the past, it means understanding it without letting it dictate the future. Writing eventually led to a project that would change everything. I'm Glad My Mom Died. The title alone represented a level of honesty Jennette once believed she could never express. It was not a celebration of death. It was an acknowledgement of freedom, a recognition that her mother's absence allowed her to break a trauma bond so deep she couldn't breathe within it. The title was a declaration of truth, a reclaiming of the narrative that once belonged solely to her mother. Writing the book required confronting memories she had suppressed her entire life. It required her to revisit the emotional landscape of her childhood with clarity rather than denial. It forced her to acknowledge the pain she endured, not in a sensational way, but in a human way. Jennette wrote with vulnerability, courage, and a determination to tell the truth regardless of how uncomfortable it was. And through writing, she found what she had been missing all along, herself. She discovered that she wasn't defined by her trauma. She wasn't defined by her mother's demands. She wasn't defined by Hollywood, fame, eating disorders, or the narratives others imposed on her. She was defined by her resilience, her honesty, her capacity for self-reflection, and her willingness to rebuild her life from the ground up. Cluster 7 concludes with the essence of Jennette's transformation. She reclaimed her identity not by escaping her past, but by understanding it, fully, honestly, courageously, and choosing to build a future shaped by her own voice. Conclusion. Jennette McCurdy's story is ultimately a story of reclamation, of taking back a life that was never truly allowed to belong to her. Through grief, therapy, painful honesty, and creative expression, she uncovers the truth of her childhood and the patterns that followed her into adulthood. Her journey shows that healing does not come from forgetting the past, but from understanding it with clarity and courage. By choosing her own voice over the one that controlled her for so long, Jennette proves that even the deepest wounds can become the foundation for self-discovery and freedom. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoy our summary based on inspiration to do something great in our life. I look forward to see you in next mini books. Don't forget to subscribe and like. This helps us reach more people. And comments are always welcome. All the best.